Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Library's Research Week of 2024. I'm Handi Strydom, the Faculty Librarian for Economic and Management Sciences, and with me is also my colleague Lucinda Roth to assist with the chat and any questions. This year's library research theme is Let's Achieve Research Excellence, and there will be several webinars. And today's theme is Let's Excel in Research Strategies. And our last speaker for today is Dr. Michael McCall with the topic Introduction and Primer to Scoping Reviews. Dr. Michael McCall is a senior lecturer in epidemiology and biostatistics, a clinical epidemiologist and guideline development enthusiast within the Department of Global Health at Stellenbosch University. He has a clinical background in emergency care, and a special interest in research methods, evidence synthesis, systematic and scoping reviews, and guideline development. Michael is involved in various guideline development projects, including across Africa and internationally, such as the World Health Organization. And Michael is also involved in editorial roles for journals, both nationally and internationally. And in his spare time, and I really like this, Dr. Michael enjoys spearfishing and trying to convince his daughter that he is not a rideable dinosaur. Dr. Michael, thank you so much for your time and for your willingness to do this presentation. And Dr. Michael confirmed that he would encourage you to ask questions during the presentation, and you're welcome to use the chat as well and afterwards as well. And over to Dr. Michael.
Annelie, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the kind introductions. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Evidence synthesis in general, scoping reviews specifically. So thank you so much for the kind words. And yes, I do like spearfishing, and I often have to be a daddy jungle gym for my 6-year-old daughter. I think interestingly enough, this week she actually learned how to ride a bicycle. So I'm a very proud daddy at the moment. So colleagues, as Annelies mentioned, you're more than welcome to engage with me on the chat. You're more than welcome to raise your hand during the talk. It's quite a didactic session. We've got about an hour and a half together, but we would like to encourage you to please ask questions during the session if there's something coming to mind that you would like to ask. I'll have an eye on the chat. I'll have an eye on the participants, and if the hand's raised, then please, I'll definitely keep an eye for that. So, as I mentioned, I'll be giving an introduction to scoping reviews, which is one of the kind of methods we can use, study designs we can use within evidence synthesis, which is really around doing research or asking a question about research, or where the unit of analysis, the thing that we're trying to gather and collect is published studies or unpublished studies. Now, this is, part of the Library Week, which is part of within the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. And so, although I'll be talking about scoping reviews, which is a cross-cutting study design that is applicable to whatever discipline you might find yourself in, whether it be theology, economics, health sciences, basic sciences. The examples that I'll be using is kind of central to my space, my discipline of global health and public health, and in guidelines. So I'll have some examples in healthcare, but please don't be discouraged by that. I think a lot of the methods I'll be talking about is cross-cutting, interdisciplinary, and cross-disciplinary. So yeah, please just note that. Just checking if with a thumbs up, everyone can see my screen as I'm moving forward, right?
We can see your screen, thank you.
Excellent, excellent. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me well. Thanks for the thumbs up, everyone. Ms. Henning and et al. All right, so, as a quick mention, what I would like to achieve at the end of this talk really is for you to understand the value of evidence synthesis, which I think is essential in order to appreciate what scoping reviews intend to do. I give you a broad overview of the types of evidence syntheses out there and where scoping reviews fit into that synthesis ecosystem, right? And then I think it's important that we understand the steps of doing a scoping review, and then to dive deeper per step to see around what components is required in a scoping review protocol, and by extension, what are the different components would look like in how you would eventually present or do a scoping review. I'll also take you through some useful resources that I have found to be essential when it comes to scoping reviews. So, this is a talk in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, and a lot of what we do is to impact health for and in Africa. And, we can't talk about scoping reviews and the evidence, the model of evidence synthesis, if we don't talk about evidence-based medicine. And in a nutshell, if we want to make healthcare decisions, or even say something, make a truth claim, we need to consider not just the evidence, which is one sphere in how we make healthcare decisions, but we also need to consider all the other components thereof, including clinical judgment, patient values, and preferences. So in evidence synthesis, which is often the precursor to making the thing that informs making a claim about healthcare, we have to take into consideration the effectiveness evidence, but also evidence around perspectives, affordances, cost, feasibility, acceptability. And Sackett et al. Have kind of pushed forward this model many years ago, and it's kind of what we use to make evidence-based healthcare decisions. And linked to this, many of you would know this if you're in the health faculty, the 5 A's of evidence-based healthcare. Now, if you're not within the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences or in a health paradigm, then this might be foreign to you. But the principles of what we're explaining here is linked to how evidence synthesis operates and how scoping reviews, in a sense, are conducted. And it starts off by asking what the question is. This might come from kind of background literature, it might come from a patient scenario, it might come from a question that a colleague asked you. And it's, I would say and argue, probably the most important step in any evidence synthesis journey you're taking is, what is the question? What is the background question? So why is the question important? And is it a clear question? Without those 3 things, I would say you shouldn't even move forward to the next step. Next step is typically accessing the literature. That's where the library services are so essential to us. And then, of course, when you find evidence, maybe by a mechanism like a scoping review, often, in order to say whether we can trust or use that evidence, we need to appraise it for its internal validity. In other words, how close it is to the truth. And then we need to apply the results to our scenario, or write up the results, and see whether it actually has impact and changes lives. Now, this whole cycle is all good and well, but it doesn't come without key challenges when it comes to implementing or doing evidence-based medicine, or informing kind of decisions in your setting. And there are many challenges and examples that I can show and things that can have gone wrong. But the kind of question is, why do we need scoping reviews? Why do we need evidence synthesis? There's lots of reasons. And one of the main things is, who should we believe when people are making claims? Or when we want to make a claim, what should our evidence be based on? Now, there's challenges, one, we know, in finding evidence. And COVID has kind of highlighted this even more with this massive information overload, this anecdotal evidence that's popping up around diets or interventions like ivermectin. So who should we trust? And this is where you can't just cherry pick a single study and say, oh, I trust this because it's empirical evidence. We need to look at the totality of evidence in order to make healthcare decisions. So there's lots of issues. There's information overload, 74 trials published per annum, per day, sorry. It's impossible to get through. Anecdotal evidence, people or experts like the issue here with the US pediatrician, Dr. Benjamin Spock, who said kids can sleep on their tummies, and that led to SIDS. Publication bias. If you look at papers in index journals, they're more likely to have positive results compared to those that haven't been published. There's reporting biases. People like reporting positive results or only report the results that they like or have good outputs. Then, of course, we've got the issue around poor research and poor internal validity. And even though we're looking at a randomized controlled trial, it might not be a well-conducted one. And of course, file draw bias, which is a big issue that we face with regards to evidence synthesis, that we just cherry pick what we want based on no systematic and transparent method. So it's difficult, we have an infodemic. And evidence synthesis helps us kind of bridge that gap. It tries to help us get the best available evidence that's current, valid, and up to date. And I guess relevant as well, contextually appropriate. And so that's what EVP tries to do. And research synthesis, which is the topic which scoping reviews are kind of placed in, is where we put together the process of synthesizing 2 or more research studies are assessed with the objective of summarizing evidence relating to a particular question. And so Ian Chambers, one of the founders of the Cochrane collaboration, which I would very much encourage everyone to have a look at, gave this fantastic kind of quote here, just to say that we need to look at the bigger context here. Science is a cumulative process. We need to know what's happened before in order to move forward. And then research synthesis allows us to evaluate the results of a given study in context. Philemon, I note that you are wondering about my volume. I'm just checking, is my volume okay for most people on the call? It might just be that. It's
fine.
Okay, thanks everyone. I see lots of thumbs up. Philemon, perhaps just increase your volume either in Teams or on your computer. Either way, so this brings us to scoping reviews. And Oxley and O'Malley, gave this definition for a scoping review. And its scoping reviews in general have grown in popularity over the last decade or so. And this definition from a seminal paper, although there is kind of considerable variability in how it's defined, the essence of a scoping review is to map a particular body of evidence and to describe what is available or what type of things is available. And it can be undertaken in a variety of ways, as they mentioned. And they've developed kind of a framework for conducting scope reviews that was further improved by Levac in 2010. Either way, I've highlighted there the main points of a scoping review. And scoping reviews often get confused with systematic reviews. And that's the first big point I want to emphasize here, is that a systematic review indeed does differ from a scoping review. And here you can read the definition by Moher, quite an old definition, but I think still very much relevant today. A systematic review is a review in which bias has been reduced by a systematic identification, appraisal, and synthesis, often perhaps statistically, of all relevant studies on a specific topic according to a predetermined and explicit method. And I would add here to a question that is intended to have impact at a global level. And typically, systematic reviews are often used to inform healthcare questions. Should we or should we not intervene with this drug, medicine, or technology? It fundamentally differs from a scoping review, where a scoping review just tries to map and describe what there is. It doesn't try to explicitly answer a predefined question of effect, prognosis, or management, or diagnosis, where systematic reviews very much has a focused question that it teams to answer, and it includes critical appraisal of the studies and a very specific, transparent way of synthesizing that information, where a scoping review is just there to kind of describe what exists. I'm not seeing any hands up so far, which is worrying. So I want to encourage people to ask questions if they have. And I don't see anything else in the chat coming up. Feel free to engage. So please do. So, Michael, great. I'm thinking of doing a scoping review, but where does it fit into the world of making healthcare decisions? And I like using this kind of infographic from Magic App. And here you can see kind of the evidence ecosystem. So how evidence moves from step one, which is typically where the primary evidence comes from, right? We plan to conduct primary research. That's trials, observational studies, case controls, and so on, case control studies. your typical epi stuff. Now that's produced. It then eventually goes and it hopefully through a systematic review, a particular question gets answered. And in our case, for healthcare, a healthcare question, systematic reviews inform clinical practice guidelines or guidance or health technology assessments, which is the kind of the ultimate vehicle for moving evidence into policy and practice. But it needs help via kind of user tools, guides, or decision aids. And then it needs to be implemented via mechanisms, digitized in step number 5, barriers and facilitators assessed, and eventually kind of you monitor and evaluate it and start back with the process number 1. Now, scoping reviews fit in is in between number 1 and 2. We often use scoping reviews to kind of understand what there is regarding primary evidence or secondary evidence, scoping reviews of systematic reviews, to inform colleagues the development of a systematic review. That's one of the main reasons we do scoping reviews, is often as the precursor to doing a systematic review, because starting with a systematic review from scratch, de novo, new, is even just doing the protocol and doing an initial search is months of work if you're doing it properly. And often it's not even worth it to go down that route, especially if you're not doing your systematic review and you find actually there isn't enough studies for me to do a systematic review. They're not asking the right question, or there is too much perhaps, and our review question is way too broad. We should have had a better idea of what there is, and then from there inform our review question, our systematic review question. So scoping reviews, I think, primarily is that, as I said, as a precursor to in between step 1 and 2 in this evidence ecosystem. So I've given you a bit of an overview now around kind of evidence-based healthcare, evidence synthesis, where scoping reviews generally fit into this ecosystem. I'm going to check quickly on anyone on the call. Do you have any questions? 1. And 2, maybe can I have a raise of hands or a thumbs up if you are planning on doing a scoping review or are doing one currently? Give me a thumbs up. Give me a thumbs up. I see lots of thumbs up, actually. My goodness, that's great news. I do see some hands up though, which is great. So let me go through that. So Dr. Nita, is your hand up? Did you want to ask? Excuse me,
yes,
did you want to ask a question?
Thank you very much. So my question is, and thank you for this excellent explanation about the difference between systematic and scoping. So my question is, after one has done, because the scoping review, what I'm understanding, it's a description. Does one then recommend a systematic review post the scoping review? Because we're answering the question, right? One, and my work is in public health and looking at models in specifically in Africa. So that's my specific question. And then does that add value or no value if you're not recommending a systematic review or moving towards a systematic review? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you so much, Maura. So to answer your question, a scoping review is a valuable piece of work, irrespective of whether it moves to a systematic review or not. That's the one thing. So I think a scoping review as a standalone project to describe a body of evidence or a topic area has scientific value if the gap is appropriate that you've identified. That's the one question answer, I would say. The other one is, I guess it's part of what the purpose is of a scoping review. If your purpose is to eventually do a systematic review, but you're not entirely sure about what the question might be, then a scoping review's purpose would be to inform the question for your systematic review. But at the end, the literal results or conclusion of your scoping review doesn't necessarily have to be a review. A conclusion of your scoping review might not necessarily be, we recommend doing a systematic review on the following question. That's more of an organic discussion that happens post your scoping review results. So, for example, we're doing currently a scoping review, designing a protocol for community preparedness interventions in infectious disease infectious disease spaces, because the systematic review is just really, we're not entirely sure what this body of what the kind of evidence space is. We first want to look at a scoping review. What kind of interventions are people looking at? Who are the stakeholders involved? You know, how does community preparedness fit into this? Kind of map out the whole place. And then from there say, okay, well, yeah, here's a gap, or here's a big line of evidence that we might move down. Does that help?
It's excellent, because I'm actually looking at community involvement models in Africa. So that's my scoping review. So thank you very much.
Excellent. I mean, if you've got a general question around, you know, what is the what are the characteristics, or what is the availability of community, whatever models, then I think that's a fantastic scoping review question. But we'll get into a bit of nitty-gritty just now. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, but thank you very much for that question. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let's zoom in a bit on scoping reviews. Now, I think one of the biggest things I also want to say linked to this is that before you even start any evidence synthesis work, please first look for what is out there. It's very likely that a scoping review or something much earlier has already been done. And you can then build on that, update that scoping review. But at least you have a good baseline. If COVID has taught us anything, it's that we, at evidence synthesis level, are doing, as academics and researchers, an incredible disservice to everyone by doing reviews, scoping, systematic, when it's not necessary, when the answer is already there, when someone's already done a review, and we simply just need to update it or look at the review for our answers. So before you do a scoping review, have you checked any prospective registries like Prospero or scoping review registries, whether the topic is being done by an author team? If so, connect with them and see if you can join the team or update the review or take a different angle. Have you searched, and in brackets well, for existing scoping and or systematic reviews on the topic? Have you looked at the Cochrane website? Have you looked at Prospero? Have you done a Boolean operated search in PubMed for systematic reviews or existing scoping reviews? And then if there's no to all of those, in other words, if there is a gap, do you have a clear rationale for doing your scoping review? What is its purpose? Will it add to our understanding of the literature in that space, in that topic area? If those kind of three high-level questions are kind of met, then I would say let's go ahead with a scoping review. Yeah, so that's the first thing I want to do. So, true to their name, scoping reviews are the ideal tool to determine the scope or coverage of a body of literature on a given topic and give a clear indication of kind of the volume of literature and studies available, as well as in kind of an overview, broad or detailed, of its focus. And here I present some key indications for doing scoping reviews. And in general, you know, they're useful for examining emerging evidence when it's still unclear what other more specific questions can be posed or valuably kind of be addressed by a more precise systematic review. They can report on the types of evidence that address and inform practice in a field and then the way the research has been conducted. It's descriptive in nature. So it can be used to identify the types of evidence available in a given field, to clarify key concepts or definition in the literature. I was involved with a student who wanted to define kind of all the different, describe and define kind of definitions around very low birth weight in infants. And that was quite well received. So kind of look at how other people are defining these kind of kiddos and describing what kind of evidence is informing that. It can be used to examine how research is conducted on a certain topic or field. It can identify characteristics or factors related to a concept. So a kind of a precursor to a conceptual framework, for example. it, of course, as I mentioned, can be a precursor to a systematic review, or kind of allow us to look at evidence and say, well, here's a gap and here's a clear question, perhaps. For example, when the World Health Organization develops guidelines, they first do scoping reviews to understand what is the current evidence base around the topic that they would like to provide guidance on, to inform questions and downstream systematic reviews. And of course, you can also use scoping reviews to identify and analyze gaps in evidence. Excellent. I'm just checking if there's something in the chat here. Well, can one, yeah, so there's a question here, can one do a scoping review as a research project? If yes, to what level? So I would say a scoping review is, depending on its depth, is a great honors level research project. And if you go in a bit more depth at master's level, I think a scoping review is very appropriate. I would go as far as to say that depending on your depth and the kind of package of, I won't go into the doctorate now, it's not useful, but typically my experience has been that at honors and especially master's level, it can be done. So it's very valuable study design. And I can maybe speak a bit more to that if needed. Then the second question by Moodley is, can you use a scoping review and then decide on using a traditional review? I'm not sure what you mean by traditional review. Maybe you can just let me know by what you mean there. You mean traditional review as in a systematic review? Just maybe help me clarify that. All right, but I'll be moving on. Let me know if I answered those questions appropriately. Otherwise, I haven't asked them again. So I'm going to just show you this kind of framework, again by Axley. And here are some of the key kind of steps, components of doing a scoping review. You know, Levack did talk about kind of the challenges with these steps and recommendations and how to address them on the right-hand column. I'll go through them very briefly, quickly. So first step, and as I mentioned, probably the most important step, is to identify the question that you're asking. Scoping reviews typically have a broad question that typically uses verbs like mapping, describing, and so forth, right? But you identify the question, but there needs to be a clear linkage between the purpose and the question. So again, this speaks to the previous colleague's question around, a scoping review informing a systematic review, or a scoping review informing gaps in the evidence. Depending on why you're doing it, the purpose, it would kind of shape your question to a certain degree and the kind of wording that you're using. Of course, you need to identify relevant studies, and I'll go into more detail and unpack these steps. But again, scoping reviews by definition are trying to scope an entire body of literature in a space, right? And there you can easily bite off more than you can chew if you're not being specific enough about study selection and criteria for what it is that's going to most likely answer your research question that you have. Often, one would want to stay within a certain study design paradigm, like you only want to look at primary research. And within that, you want to think about, well, what part of that primary research I would not be interested in, like case series or editorials, policy documents. Or you only want to look at guidelines, or you only want to look at systematic reviews. Either way, so you need to balance this, the feasibility of your scoping review, because it can take at least a year to do a scoping review properly from beginning to end. There's study selection. Again, it speaks to number 2, is being very clear about what you want to include and what not, and that's going to influence your study selection criteria. And they mention it as being a bit of an iterative team approach. I would say that the more you can clarify a priori in your protocol, the better, because the last thing you want is to have a lot of gray zone where you're not sure on what studies to include or not to include. Charting data, again, this is a descriptive process in general, and it can be both quantitative or qualitative, or in a mixed method way. but is typically, irrespective of the paradigm, this kind of qualitative or positivistic quantitative paradigm, it's going to be descriptive in nature. And they kind of say, often what's happened now, as opposed to previously, is that these scoping reviews have now incorporated both numerical summary, so quantitative summary, counting characteristics, and kind of descriptive, qualitative, thematic analyses of a particular topic, if the purpose speaks to it. Again, eventually you're going to collate this, which I used the word synthesis, which is, I think, a bit more of the general term of putting together, as opposed to formally meta-aggregating. You're not meta-aggregating. You are putting together so that it's readable. And then again, there's other steps like consultation, checking in around methods, internal validity. So I'm still, Mr. Moodley or Miss Moodley, Vera, sorry, I still don't understand what you mean by traditional, but perhaps on the next couple of slides, when I talk about the different kind of systematic, different kind of evidence syntheses out there, you can place what you mean by traditional. Because use of one or more databases for articles, maybe as a general rule, I can just say that if you're doing evidence synthesis, international practice and guidance state that you should at least use 2 or more databases. And we don't classify the type of evidence synthesis based on how many databases you use. So expanding on this framework, here are some key, more detailed steps of doing a scoping review. And later on in the recording, you can maybe have a look at this in detail. And I'm not going to go through every one, but I've highlighted here some of the key things I want to just bring your attention to. And that is, have a clear gap in the evidence base. Have an identified clear gap in the evidence base. Have a clearly formulated scoping review question. And here the finer criteria, which you can Google, finer criteria is still very applicable. You need to have clear eligibility criteria. Know what kind of study designs is best going to answer your question that you formulated. It very seldom, in my experience, helps if you say, I'm going to include all the literature, because that is a very big bucket you don't generally want to get involved with. And it's going to include everything from someone's thoughts in a commentary, which is often not very useful, to policy document. The breadth is too much. So you're going to be screening 20,000 papers, and that's not what you want. Then, for searching, my main advice is to have a clear question, have that question components be clear. So you might have heard about the PICO framework for doing good review questions, but here for scoping review, you can use many variations of that, the PPC framework, the PO framework, but essentially it starts off with identifying the population, the outcome, or the context, or the issue at hand. And if your question has those elements within it, then you're likely to have a more robust question and have easier time finding search strings for your Boolean, for your searching. And so we link to searching. I want to encourage people, please, to use an information specialist in doing this. Of course, the first port of call would be your librarians and working closely with them. But when it comes to searching, I think someone who has ample experience as an information specialist is important to approach. Data extraction, again, this is often done independently and in duplicate. And I would think very carefully about this, and even think about what is the descriptive product I'm aiming to produce, and have a mock-up of what that might look like to guide your objectives and data extraction tools that you might want to use. And then, that speaks to the data analysis as well, which can vary, but it's typically via tables, typically descriptive in nature, and depending on the question, it can include qualitative, descriptive analysis too. So again, differences between different common forms of synthesis that we are exposed to. So I'm putting the kind of the literature review there in the first bit, and perhaps Vera, this is what you were referring to when you spoke about a traditional review. I guess it could also be considered a narrative review, a literature review, the kind of review that you would do in the introduction of any kind of paper or for an assignment. And it differs very substantially to a systematic review and a scoping review. A literature review or a narrative review, or some call, I guess, a traditional review, terms all over the place. There is no real purpose to it. It's just to describe what there is, perhaps for an assignment, but the purpose varies. It really depends on what the ask is. It doesn't, importantly, have any pre-specified methods. There's no method of doing a literature review. There's no systematic process that's reproducible. It's just fishing for information, really. It doesn't have a comprehensive and transparent search. You're not publishing your search or testing it or making it reproducible for others so that they can replicate your literature review. That's definitely not the purpose of it. You're not a priori specifying why you are including or not including particular study designs. So you're not specifying this can't be reproducible. You are not formally appraising the internal validity of every single study you include in a literature review. You might talk about validity and what you thought of the papers, but you're not formally doing it via a tool or some kind of approved method. And of course, you're not statistically or even qualitatively via meta-aggregation synthesizing the results. You might be putting things together in the loosest form of the word we use, synthesis, but it's definitely not reproducible. You're not specifying the methods of your synthesis. You're just putting two things together in a narrative. So whereas systematic reviews is the exact opposite. It's purposes for decision making. It's very pre-specified methods throughout the process. It has to include critical appraisal of included studies. It often is very specific about what type of studies it includes, which specifically speak to the kind of question it has. So, for example, if you're asking an effectiveness question, it will include effectiveness research, like trials, and it is reproducible. Whereas a scoping review is often towards identifying gaps in the evidence. It has pre-specified methods and searches. So in other words, a systematic review and a scoping review are the same when it comes to the first couple of steps of finding the evidence. But as soon as you found the evidence, scoping reviews start to veer off from a systematic review, where it's not towards a kind of a statistical or qualitative aggregation. It's around describing what happens. And sometimes scoping reviews, depending on the scope and the level that you're doing it at, it might include a critical appraisal of the included studies. And synthesis is a general no, it's not, but it may include descriptive synthesis in that sense, but it's not a statistical or meta-aggregative qualitative process. I'm checking whether that makes sense to people, because I think this is essential to understand, especially the difference between systematic and scoping review. So here's a very busy slide, and you can have a look at it in more detail, but later this is a slide that I've made for my M students. And again, this is kind of talking about the comparative summary of evidence synthesis research generally. I think there's a bit more linked to this, but in general, I've kind of have all of these different kind of evidence synthesis products, ranging from scoping reviews, systematic reviews, to all these other different kind of systematic review variations, like diagnostic test accuracy systematic reviews or qualitative evidence synthesis. So in other words, a systematic review of qualitative studies, prognostic reviews, prognostic model reviews, overview of reviews, or what's called umbrella reviews. Reviews of reviews is another word for it, or living systematic reviews, systematic reviews that are continuously updated, like what we had for COVID live. Rapid systematic reviews, reviews that are systematic reviews but just done with an infinitely smaller timeline. In other words, in 6 weeks or a month instead of 2 years. As you can see there was the timeline row. Or method reviews, in other words, meta research. So reviews about the methods of doing reviews, or reviews around how we better do reviews. And I guess the main point I have here is that scoping reviews, scope is broad versus most of the other ones being quite narrow or dynamic. The pico elements we engage with is often far more limited than the other kind of review types. The unit of analysis varies, the thing it's analyzing. It can include primary and secondary data. In other words, you could have a scoping review of reviews or scoping reviews of primary evidence. Critical appraisal is optional, whereas any other form of evidence synthesis at the systematic spectrum has some kind of critical appraisal tool that's advised to be used. And it's obvious, it's very much dependent on what your question is. If you're doing a systematic review of interventions, you're doing ROB 2.0. If you're doing diagnostic test accuracy systematic review, you're using STARD or XYZ for other reviews, right? But in scoping, it's quite dynamic. It varies what we use. It depends on the question and what you're including. Again, you can have a look at the synthesis method. It varies. But again, here, timeline and budget-wise, I would say, and time-wise, it's not as intense as any of the other forms. And the expertise required is relatively simple because it's broad questions, it's descriptive in nature, and it doesn't actively require you to do some kind of meta-synthesis, right? It's descriptive. It's the cross-sectional study of secondary research. That's another way of putting it. And I guess the other thing I want to highlight from this table is that right at the bottom, I talk about reporting checklists. Now, each of these synthesis methods has got very specific, sometimes it doesn't, reporting checklists for to inform quality reporting, right? So there's a great one called PRISMA SCR or PRISMA for scoping reviews. So if you're doing a scoping review or you're doing it for your thesis, your your honors, your doctorate, I would use the PRISMA SCR to inform the reporting of your scoping review according to international based standards. Right, so I'm going to place this slide here while I look at the comments. You're welcome to read through this. This is from Laser AI. And yes, I'm just different kind of questions that systematic reviews and scoping reviews have asked. That's been, just to put it out there, and I'll comment on it just now. So try and look at this and see what is fundamentally different between the two questions, between systematic and scoping. And these are kind of questions that emerges or one would ask from scoping. So I'll give you some time to look at that. Elizabeth, thank you for your question. Can you explain what you mean by meta-aggregative? Yeah, so it's a bit of my own term, my apologies, but what I'm trying to refer to is not just your typical, when we say synthesis, it's a very old and broad term, which just means putting studies together, right? Putting them together. But we know synthesis can be very simple. It can just be, we can do synthesis in a literature review, which has no inherent predefined structure in how we do that synthesis, right? It will be done by someone differently every single time they do it. And then we've got on the other spectrum here, we've got other forms of synthesis, and perhaps I call it, I guess it's linked to the word meta-analysis or meta-synthesis or meta-aggregation, all different terms we use for pooling studies together formally via a specific paradigm or method to come to a solid answer that we've posed that is reproducible to a certain extent, and that has an underlying theory and paradigm or method. That's what I mean by kind of meta, as opposed to just descriptive narrative synthesis that one would do in a literature review. Trying to distinguish between synthesis in a literature review and meta-analysis, meta-synthesis. Yeah, and so there's a question here again. Thank you so much, JM. What is the difference between rapid systematic reviews and rapid reviews? Yeah, So it is a good question. I think there's some debates about all of these terms. Generally, a rapid systematic review is a systematic review that is done as per a traditional systematic review format, except the only difference is it's done in an exceptionally short period of time. For example, in COVID, and even now today to a certain extent, we do systematic reviews, but it's done because it's in a rapid form. In other words, instead of years, it takes days by throwing a big budget at it and large experienced teams, and often AI and kind of sourcing of screeners and so forth. So it's a rapid systematic review is just simply a systematic review done in a short turnaround time, whereas rapid reviews are typically, it's a systematic review product, but where shortcuts have been taken. For example, no double screening, limited databases are searched, no meta-analysis used, and so forth. So we did rapid reviews often during COVID because policymakers wanted immediate answers for immediate policy to affect health immediately. We can't spend 2 years doing it comprehensively via systematic review. We did rapid reviews and took some shortcuts. Yeah. Okay. So then again, thanks for those questions. Regarding this slide then, as you can see, scoping reviews typically use the words to identify existing evidence or the breadth of, to map and describe, map and synthesize, to explore, whereas the systematic review questions are being far more specific around comparing one thing to another to determine the effect of X and Y versus Y on this particular outcome for this particular condition. It's far more narrow, far more specific, far more driven than the broader kind of scoping review questions. And I guess this then brings me to the other key element is a scoping review protocol. And when you do any kind of research, you need to have a protocol or a map set out for how you will do this. And we often find that our scoping review protocols are being published, as opposed in the past, not that necessarily being the case, so it's more prevalent in systematic reviews. So why a protocol? And this is in a sense self-explanatory, but I think it's very important because often we say, oh no, we're just doing a scoping review, so we don't really need a protocol. We're just going to put our question out there and then start searching and see what we find. That's a recipe for disaster. And similar to how we do primary research or even secondary research, it's good to have a roadmap, everyone. And here, the protocol provides you a plan for what to do so that you're not cherry picking or introducing bias, even at the scoping review level, which is very prevalent. It predefines your objectives and methods. So you know what this plan is. You know what the purpose of your scoping review. It allows for transparency. It promotes consistency in the conduct and accountability of your methods. And many other affordances, right? It allows the reader to have reproducibility and to see if there's any deviations from what you did to what you said you were going to do. And the main thing I want to maybe highlight linked to a protocol for doing a scoping review or considering one is, besides, having appropriate ethical approval and so forth and so on, I would prospectively register your topic on an open source database or registry, so that if others want to also perhaps do a scoping review in the topic area, they would find your topic and discover it and not duplicate work. So there's many registries that one can use in order to register or make your protocol open access and searchable. Okay, so let's quickly go through some components of a protocol that we're going to see, and I'll go through each of these components and can also give a bit of an examples around how one should, how the results and everything should be reported. So you can read through those key components. Those are the main things I put forward while I read a quick question from Elizabeth. Meta-analysis is, however, a form of review that includes a statistical analysis aspect of the data set. So I was just not sure what you're referring to. Yeah, meta-aggregation is a form of meta-analysis within the qualitative paradigm, right? It's called meta-aggregation. So if you look at the kind of the theory around qualitative evidence syntheses, those kind of words will come around. Where meta-analysis is typically used for the kind of positivistic quantitative synthesis statistical process in a systematic review. Not just of data sets, but of studies, right? That's the unit of analysis when we do meta-analysis. It's studies, aggregate level data. Okay. Yeah, and a question around only come across health science registries. Are there non-health science registries? I don't know. Elizabeth, good question. There might be, but as far as I know, health sciences in the space of evidence synthesis, broadly speaking, is kind of leading in the field, in the discipline. But I'm happy to be corrected on that. All right, so here are your typical components of a protocol. Your background isn't going to be very long, and these are the main headings that I would propose you have. And when it kind of comes to zooming in on methods, there's a couple of subheadings that I would advise you have, as you can see there. But one of the main things I also look at is the PRISMA statement for scoping reviews, because in there you'll also get quite a lot of headings that I think would guide your write-up. And here you can see from the methods, some of the key things that I think is essential to have a look at. Assessment of risk of bias of included studies. That is optional. It's not always applicable in a scoping review, so it doesn't always have to be there. So quickly go through the background and rationale. What do we already know? That's kind of the question that we're placing there. So it typically involves kind of description of the condition or the issue, the concept that you're trying to describe, or the topic area. If you're looking at a more interventional lens, it might be the description of the thing that you're trying to describe in literature. So often it's you have a population of interest. What is the literature around people who have HIV, who are exposed to XYZ, or who have received XYZ, or whatever the case may be? You'd want to bring all of those kind of information into the foreground of your review. We need to have a clear indication of the rationale. So why do we need to do a scoping review? What's the purpose of the review? Is it plugging a gap? Why do we need to describe the evidence or this topic in this area? Typically at 2 to 3 pages, appropriate and recent references, specifically on if other reviews have been done in this space. I guess the main point here is that the background and rationale it needs to be well placed, and you need to know that you are indeed doing research in a particular gap. So the gap must be there. There shouldn't be an existing scoping review in this space, or you need to motivate why you're doing your one specifically in that case. Again, review questions and objectives. So we typically use what's called the PICO framework, and specifically variations thereof, to help guide the structure of our scoping review and or systematic review question. So we call it the PICO format, where we are essentially, for those who don't know, identify the population of interest, the issue or the intervention, the comparison or the context in this case, and the outcomes, right, that we're interested in. And if those components are generally addressed in your question, then you have a more robust question than not using that kind of framework. Typically, in the scoping review space, we typically might want to focus on the PPO or PPC, the population kind of setting or place and context, or population perspective context, PPC. There's many variations of these formats, but you can have a look at the evidence yourself. But generally, you want to use some kind of framework to phrase your question. It's typically broader. It typically starts with things like to map existing X, Y, Z, to identify gaps in, to describe the evidence on or the characteristics of. So it's always in the paradigm of exploring, mapping, identifying, describing. Those are the kind of buzzwords you can use when setting up your review question. You might have a kind of a broad question, describing a particular topic area for a particular purpose, and then you might go a bit deeper into more sub-objectives and say, okay, well, we specifically want to unpack following terms, or we want to describe X, Y, Z, or we want to produce a framework. It can really vary. So, for example, here we've got a scoping review of guidelines, looking at the status and quality of pre-hospital kind of guidelines in sub-Saharan Africa. And here you can see at the bottom there, they've kind of placed the review in the context that very little is known about the scope and quality of pre-hospital guidance in sub-Saharan Africa. And they've this author has placed the review in the context of this paucity, really. So they wanted to describe and appraise existing guidelines in pre-hospital care in general, sub-Saharan Africa. And once you have your question, then you kind of move to eligibility criteria. And it's very much should be driven by the kind of question you're asking and the kind of, I guess, discipline you're in. From a health kind of space, global health space, first thing we want to look at is what type of studies you're wanting to consider. And it's again dependent on the question. It might be that you're looking at only clinical guidelines, or only systematic review, or only randomized trials, or only primary kind of observational research, or qualitative research, or you're only looking at, if you're not even in this paradigm, policy documents, or abstracts from ancient documents, whatever it may be. It's dependent on the question, but the purpose of the eligibility is to be very clear about what you are including and what you are not including. Typically, and this is a very big rule of thumb, we don't like mixing lots of designs together because it's very difficult to describe holistically systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials together. You typically want to stay in one band, right? To describe both qualitative and quantitative research together is very difficult because they have very different paradigms and purposes. So we typically want to be quite specific about what we're including. It might be that we also want to only include research that only speaks to a particular population of interest, or type of interventions or concepts or settings. For example, in this previous one, we're only looking at pre-hospital setting, clinical practice guidelines, the type of evidence, guidelines, in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Those are the three kind of big criteria we considered for the scoping review when it comes to including research. We excluded qualitative research, trials, and systematic reviews. We only looked at clinical practice guidelines, and those were well defined. Yeah, and so again, this is one way of looking at it, but if you're generally asking these kind of questions, this is the kind of design that's best answers it. In a scoping review, these question types won't come up. These are quite systematic review-centric questions, linked to the best kind of primary study design, but the principle holds. If you have a scoping review question, there are certain studies that just aren't going to give you the kind of information you want. So for example, are commentaries written by experts in the field of relevance to you at all, compared to primary research, systematic reviews? So again, here's an example of the eligibility criteria for this paper of a student of mine. They included pre-hospital relevant guideline documents, but I think importantly, they say we excluded X, Y, Z. We excluded healthcare infrastructure, administrative, or medical textbooks. So you need to think about what am I including and what's likely don't I want. And that's the same thing for any kind of synthesis that you do. Searching, you'd want to search at least 2 primary peer-reviewed indexed databases. Depending on your topic area, some databases won't be relevant, right? In the health sciences space, you'd want to search at least PubMed and EBSCOhost, for example, CINAHL. If you're looking for systematic reviews, then you'd want to go to things like the Cochrane Library and PubMed. If you're not looking at systematic reviews, you don't even need to look at the Cochrane Library, for example. So it can vary, but at least 2 indexed databases. When it comes to searching grey literature, which is often very valuable in scoping reviews, you need to be explicit about what journals you're looking for, what conference papers you're looking for, what experts are you contacting, what type of papers you might be screening their reference lists for, what reference papers, what kind of study designs, reference lists you're going to be screening to maybe look at grey literature. Again, the search methods, how your search string is designed, is based on your search, your kind of PICO framework and the population problem context kind of way of placing it. When it comes to grading your search terms, you want to use text words and mesh terms within a Boolean framework. And this is where information specialist and librarian will be essential. When I examine scoping reviews or whatever the case may be, peer review them, if I don't see mesh terms in addition to text words, I often just reject the paper outright. I'm being facetious here, but it's a big tell on the expertise of the review group, the author team, if they are not using information specialist or even mesh terms in their search strings. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be reproducible. You need to pilot your search to get an idea of the scope of what you're looking at. Are you willing to sift through 20,000 results? And what do you think of those 20,000 you're going to screen from? You're actually meaningfully willing to find full text for and do data extraction on. If you're yielding 20,000, and you think 10% of that you might include, that's 2,000 full text papers you must screen and potentially include and do data extraction on. That's 2 years worth of work minimum. So be very careful and have an information specialist on hand to make sensitive and specific searches. Otherwise, you'll be in trouble. Again, here's just a bit of a extract around kind of information sources and the kind of wording that's used. You can see here we used 2 big databases, PubMed and Scopus, and we searched for kind of key websites and clearinghouses around kind of our topic of guidelines. Interestingly enough, we used Google Scholar, and my general kind of just advice to people using that is it's not reproducible. It's a search engine, not a database. But I think importantly, thirdly, use the first max 100 results, 10 pages, typically in a Google search, and stop. That's your yield from Google Scholar. Anything else is pretty much riff-raff. And again, reproducibility. You should be able to publish your search strategy. It must be in a reproducible, publishable appendix when you publish eventually. People need to be able to reproduce your work. And if you don't have that, then it's not likely you'll get accepted for publication. Right, so data collection, there's 2 phases to this. It's screening your search yield, right? And that's typically done by 2 reviewers to reduce error, often done in duplicate and independently. So you screen the titles and abstracts as they relate to your eligibility criteria. Once that's done, let's say you've got 10,000 hits, right? And 1,000 of them, 100 of them you think are eligible. You would then obtain the full text of that 100 potentially eligible papers, then in detail go through those full texts to determine whether they are eligible, and then include them in your study officially. Typically at that level where you're screening full text, you'd have a table with reasons for why you're excluding those full texts. And then you'd have, of course, have a table typically describing the characteristics of included studies, which is part of data extraction. I think one of the big tips I can just give people is that when you do screening, you need to be very clear about the evidence trail during this process. How many did you yield? How many are you excluding at title and abstract level? How many are you including at full text level? With reasons for excluding at full text level in an appropriate diagram, often called a study flow diagram or colloquially called a Prisma flow diagram. Software can help you do this. There are many free softwares out there that can help you the screening and to a certain extent data extraction. And some of them are SR Distiller, SR Accelerator, Covidence, Laser AI, RYAM. All of these are software tools that can help with the screening within teams to be done in duplicate and independently. Some of them even use embedded kind of AI to kind of make it a bit, to highlight key terms to you that you can pre-specify. They're typically used for systematic reviews, but it's being more and more being used for scoping reviews. Data extraction, again, this is done for per study that you include. You need to have a data extraction form. You need to have a vision for what it is you're actually extracting numerically. Are you extracting study design? Okay. How are you classifying study designs? Are they mutually exclusive categories? How many levels will there be? Are you extracting where the study was published? Okay. How will you know where the study was published? Will you use the first author's affiliation? What characteristics are you describing? How are you defining each characteristic? Numerically, how are you operationalizing this? And what would it look like in a table of characteristics of included papers, studies? If data is missing, will you contact the authors? When will you contact the authors? Use a pre-specified and pre-piloted form. In the protocol stage, if you can't identify at least 3 papers that you really believe is going to be eligible, you have a problem. And thus, my advice is identify 3 papers and do some informal data extraction on it. What will the data look like? How are you going to describe this stuff? So here's a description of generally kind of how it's done. I say, yeah, we say 3 authors. I think it's poorly written, and I can criticize myself, I guess. It should just simply be 2 authors independently extracted data from documents, and 1/3 author perhaps did X, Y, Z. I think we can do a bit better than that. On data extraction, again, there are many things you can extract on. It's exceptionally dependent on what your question is, right? I give you some information here. My advice is to look at similar scoping reviews or look at studies that you might think be included and think about what you want to extract. How does the things you're extracting operationalize to answering your research question? If that link can't be made quantitatively or qualitatively, then you've lost the plot. So be careful with that. How are you going to describe these key findings and results? What are your main tables you're using, or graphs, or figures, or themes? All right, so here are some examples of some of the main things that we would want to extract. Synthesis or analysis, it can vary. Depending on your question, depending on your paradigm. Typically in health sciences, we often go for the positivistic, descriptive, quantitative space of doing it. But equally valid, and I think can provide far more depth, is a qualitative descriptive analysis, content or thematic, combination of the two. But it typically involves some kind of narrative summary with some kind of numerical description of what you have. It might have a table or a heat map describing the quantity of a topic coming up across like a matrix. Inferential statistics, in other words, hypothesis testing is often avoided. There's no point really in doing hypothesis testing at this level because you're not fundamentally trying to answer a research, you're not trying to prove anything. So it's descriptive in nature. So in the same sense that if you're doing a simple descriptive study, I would ask from a primary perspective, why are you doing inferential statistics if you're doing a primary study, which is the descriptive study, which is the purpose of just describing. Okay, so here you can see some of the text there to look at. And again, this is now, again, when reporting the evidence trail, this is an example of a kind of a search flow diagram. I think that many of you would be familiar with. But you can see here that there's clear evidence trail of where decisions and things came in and went out. So I'll pause on that slide for people to have a look at that. But I see there's a question in the chat. Are there any screening software tools that can be accessed without cost, free subscription? Yes, so I think Ryan is free, and I stand under correction, but one of the SR accelerators or distillers are also free. But again, it comes at either decreased functionality or smaller teams. But yeah, those are some of the major ones that you can have a look at. Covidence, as far as I understand, is not free. Perhaps portions of it might be, or for a very limited period of time. But if you want to have a year subscription, then I think it's about $600 if I remember my budgeting. But either way, I'm happy to kind of answer a bit more questions around that, my experience of using different softwares. But reporting, I just want to highlight this as we're kind of ending the 15 minutes left, and I want to have some time for questions. But reporting, it's, as I said, descriptive and narrative typically. And here you can see some examples of what that is, kind of telling us the characteristics of papers that are included, and so on and so forth. And here you can see kind of a quantitative tabulation of kind of an appraisal of some of the guidelines, documents that have been included. Again, you know, some tips for if you're writing a protocol is again, be specific, be clear about what you are doing or going to do or considering. Yes, scoping reviews are broad, but we can have robust scope protocols. So much so that you should be comfortable publishing it in an openly accessible space. It's like writing a recipe, so it's a cookbook for what you will do. It is exceptionally important. Look at published examples. People do publish their scoping reviews. Look at those examples. It is gold when it comes to understanding what a scoping review protocol is like. And again, consult with others, consult with experts, consult with information specialists, consult with evidence synthesis methodologists. And again, this is where the Division of Epi and Biostats and the Center for Evidence-Based Healthcare is, I think, leading within evidence synthesis and also in training in the faculty. And we are always open, our doors are always open for people who have questions. I would like to just reference some of the key readings that informed part of this presentation. And I just want to give a shout out to Zach Munn, the second author there, who I think has got a brilliant paper that everyone should read around systematic reviews and scoping reviews, a colleague from Australia. And then Andrea Tricco, another colleague, you know, has done quite a bit of work around methods for doing scoping reviews and has done meta studies of scoping reviews, kind of unpacking practices and reporting of scoping reviews. Can I just ask those to just put their mics off? Thank you. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll better control over who speaks. And of course, JBI, I think, has some good guidance where Zach Munn was also involved for a couple of years. More resources that I really want to point people towards is the Equator Network. Please, if you're doing any form of synthesis, always look what exists, always look at your reporting checklists. If you're a peer reviewer and you're reviewing evidence synthesis product, use the reporting checklist as a litmus test for quality reporting. As a caution, as an editor of various journals, please do not use the PRISMA statement as a critical appraisal tool or a reference for methods of how to do scoping reviews or systematic reviews. It is not the purpose of any of these tools on this website to be a methods guide. Although it can be used, it is primarily there to guide reporting standards, not methods standards. So thanks that I could harp a bit about that. Again, here's what the PRISMA extension looks like for scoping reviews. It's fantastic. Have a look at it. And again, when it comes to reducing research waste and general resources around doing evidence synthesis and or guideline development, I would encourage you to look at this paper that was done by colleagues from our university, including Prof. Young from the Department of Global Health, around how we first port of call is to reduce research waste by first finding available evidence and then considering next steps from that. And we provide a very useful guide and kind of resource around doing evidence synthesis steps and guideline development. And I just want to highlight to you in general that if you're deciding to do a scoping review or a systematic review, first clarify the issue or the kind of construct that's being informed, have a question, and then avoid duplication of effort. Don't do something someone else has done it already. Identify and appraise existing reviews for currency, credibility, and comprehensiveness. And depending on what you find, you then have various options available to you. And on this website, if you can, on COVID-N, you're welcome to have a look at it at the mcmasterforum.org. For each of these blocks, we give you valuable advice and resources around how to do each one of these steps, how to access existing reviews, how do I do critical appraisal, what tools do I have, when do I update, when do I consider replication, when do I just start de novo. And colleagues, that is my talk. I've given you a whirlwind tour introducing you to scoping reviews. My take-home message is know what's out there and first start by looking what others have done and enjoy the scoping review. I think it's a fantastic design. It's well suited in our setting, and I think it has opportunity to have, it has had impact in healthcare research. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions, and I'll hand over back to Naomi or others et al. To perhaps facilitate the conversation. Thanks. Anel, I guess. Anel, yes, over to you.
It's fine. Thank you so much, Dr. Michael. I'm wondering if you ask your question again, who is going to do a scoping review if we will have less hands now, because I also appreciate the fact that you sort of confirm that systematic reviews isn't necessarily the best option for all researchers and topics. And I think that's good to take notice of. But thank you so much for explaining the difference between scoping reviews and systematic reviews. That's a question that we receive quite a lot in the library. And for sharing the scoping review framework and especially for unpacking the steps. This is really so helpful. And I see there's a lot of questions in hand, so I'm going to hand over to our attendees and give them some time to ask you questions.
Thanks so much, Lee. Elizabeth, I think I've got your name right. Please go ahead.
Yes, you do. So I'll just introduce, I'm actually the Agri-Sciences faculty librarian. So I am the information specialist who's getting the many questions around this. So maybe some of my questions might be not really in your field, as you do say you're coming from a health sciences. So I do actually have a couple of questions here. So what often in our discipline in agri-sciences is happening is the focus is on systematic reviews or meta-analyses, and meta-analyses specifically. So as an example, they want to go see what the impact of nitrogen is across a broad spectrum of crops. When we add it in, they'll pull all the data and reanalyze it then. So in most of these cases that they're using the PRISMA protocol, but now at the end here you said that the PRISMA protocol is not a methodology. So then I'm just wondering what you meant by that.
Yeah.
But then also at the same time, what I find a lot of people struggle with in agri-sciences is the development of the topic, and specifically using the PICO framework in a way that is not health sciences orientated. So I wondered if you'd come across any alternative to it. So I like the fact that you said the emphasis is on the P or the emphasis on the PI or the PO. But that is one of the struggles, because they're not sure, especially when it comes to the population treatment, they're not sure always what they're meaning to pull out there. And then I just wondered, as a take home, I guess, if you weren't in a health sciences discipline, what would your main principles of doing something like a scoping review, or even any of your reviews kind of be? What would your advice be to people to not get confused? Because, as you said, health sciences is blazed this trail ahead, and there are very many differences and different types of reviews in health sciences, but that hasn't necessarily transferred across. So what would your advice be to those outside of health sciences that are looking at these reviews to help them not get confused by all these different kinds? So that's all my questions.
Thanks so much. And Elizabeth, please remind me if I forget them. I do have a memory issue. I can see the lack of hair in my head. So maybe I'll answer the last one, is that, I think my main take-home message for someone who isn't in the health sciences, doing evidence synthesis, is to focus on reproducibility and transparency in your methods. If you have a reproducible and transparent scoping or systematic review, then I think we're on the right track. So that's maybe my take-home message there. And again, as you would know, it all revolves around the question. If you have a clear and structured question, scoping or systematic review, your life becomes infinitely easier. The analysis becomes easier. The comparisons you make becomes easier. The synthesis, meta or not, becomes easier. So I would spend months working on the question and the protocol to get it right before jumping into a review. And then, you spoke about PRISMA, and, often it gets quoted, and I think very incorrectly in the literature, that we use PRISMA to guide our methods. But if you look at PRISMA and the purpose of PRISMA, and if you read the original papers, it's a reporting checklist. It's in the title. It should be used to report our best to report systematic reviews or scoping reviews. But it shouldn't inform how we do it. The PRISMA doesn't tell us how we should do a meta-analysis, or what the appropriate methods is for aggregating or searching or doing data extraction, or what the best practices around how many databases we should search. It doesn't tell us any of that. The evidence or the literature around doing scoping and systematic reviews should inform us. So in other words, methodological papers should inform our methods as opposed to reporting checklists. And some of the kind of go-to places I would always look at when it comes to meta-analysis is the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews. Sorry, let me rephrase my terms there. I'm using the wrong categories. I would use the Cochrane Handbook to inform my methods for doing systematic reviews and meta-analyses as my first port of call. If you're not in the health sciences space, because Cochrane is very health sciences centric, I think you can borrow a lot of the methodological principles from Cochrane to import it into agricultural sciences, for example. And then your first question, sorry, Elizabeth, around I think a particular challenge you had.
It was adapting PICO for non-health sciences to guide your question.
I would look at this COVID end resource, and we've got a particular section there that we've hyperlinked to, I think, one of the Western universities that actually has a website that has about 30 or 20 different variations of the PICO for various type of questions and formats. And I would probably delve into that resource and use that. But in principle, especially in a systematic review sense, you have to, at a certain degree, at that point, ask yourself, firstly, what kind of question are you asking? Are you asking a prognostic question? Even in agri, that's possible. A risk factor question, an effectiveness question, or so those are the three big kind of questions one can ask. And then within those questions, what's the best? There's an appropriate PICO that one can use for that. So for me, it's almost about take a step back. What type of question am I asking? Am I comparing two tests to determine whether a cattle has disease or not? Diagnostic test accuracy PICO. Or am I looking at the effectiveness of vaccine for cattle? Or am I looking at the effectiveness of irrigation systems? It still requires an underlying understanding, the question type informs the PICO. So maybe that's a good point of departure for you guys that I would recommend.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you for those questions. Spot on. Does anyone else have questions or an example they would maybe want to share with us? Reflections on doing a scoping review, perhaps, the challenges you experienced, the successes? We have a couple of minutes and then we have to end off. Elizabeth, please go ahead.
I feel like I've monopolized this entire thing, but I will just say I'm actually in the middle, hopefully, of doing a scoping review, and it's teaching and learning focused and looking at academic literacies. And I was very, very glad that you said it takes at least a year, because it has taken. We're now at a year, and we're now only getting through to our full data analysis with the data set that started at 2000 among 4 people that we had to start with. So I was glad to hear that it's not just that does take a while.
Absolutely.
That confirmation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would actually go as far to say that the average from start to publication is about a year and a half. So don't be discouraged, Elizabeth, and others, if you're attempting to do a scoping review. It does take time, especially if you want to do it appropriately, comprehensively, transparently. Yes, absolutely. And, Elizabeth, I think Susan van Swelvik's done one of the professors here in health professions education, has done some great scoping reviews that I use as reference points, considering the paradigm of health professions education. And I think that's kind of the topic that you're generally into. And their team have done some great qualitative synthesis on transformative learning topics. So do have a look at some of them. Excellent. Well, colleagues, it's 15:15. I want to respect your time. So from my side, a very big thank you. And thank you again for the library staff, colleagues, faculty for that opportunity.
Thank you so much. Bye all. And just a last reminder that we do have some more webinars tomorrow and Friday. And please join us. I've posted the link just now in the chat for the program and to register. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your day.